It comes as no surprise that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has many mysteries yet to be solved, some of which may finally be addressed in the game's sequel. The 2019 E3 trailer left us with even more questions, but it also dropped heavy hints as to what mysteries will be addressed. And it starts with a Z.
You called?
What? No, I mean the other thing that starts with a Z.
Oh, you mean Zelda.
Whatever. Back to what I was saying, it's hard to know exactly what the sequel has in store for us. It will either expand on already known mysteries or create entirely new areas to explore. Perhaps even an underground civilization, given that we see the zone ancient pillars and a huge bridge underground. So instead of a video on the sequel that is yet to come, how about we go back to the good old Hyrule of the first game? Because there are a bunch of bizarre structures and landmarks which are overshadowed by the more well-known ones. In this video, we'll look at 5 of these locations and try to find some answers with the little information we have. Again, this list will be disregarding popular ones like the Forgotten Temple and Satori Mountain because this list would have been very predictable and boring.
Exploring Breath of the Wild's world can, at first, feel like a daunting task. Unless you've increased your hearts or stamina through the game's multiple shrines, there's a good chance you won't get far until you hear that inevitable sound of a piano tune, only to die moments later. Luckily, there are many locations that provide useful weapons for early on in the game. Some, like the ancient tree stump, have weapons that are useful even towards the end game. This towering structure is found directly west of the central tower, surrounded by a small body of water. The Lizalfos that swim through these waters, in addition to the elevation of the tree, make reaching the stump from below a difficult task. Luckily, the neighbouring mountain Mount Daphnis has a trail leading to a makeshift wooden bridge. Once the player gets past the many enemies and onto the ancient stump itself, they can grab themselves a great flame blade. But aside from getting your hands on a very useful weapon, do we actually know anything about the purpose of this structure? Page 255 of Creating a Champion tells us that it used to be a massive tree with resplendent branches. Resplendent meaning attractive and impressive through being richly colourful or sumptuous. Given its description, it must have been a landmark for Hyrule in ancient times. Fast forward thousands of years, and you can see many buildings around this area, even some that are underwater. The basin surrounding the stump used to be empty. One of these wooden houses is planted on the foundation of the trail, just before the bridge. When standing atop the stump, the player gets a clear view of the surrounding areas. All the houses within the basin are too low to notice any oncoming travellers or invaders. Therefore, since one house is located at the top of the mountain, perhaps this individual was tasked with lookout duties to keep the others safe. It would require multiple people if the place were to be guarded for 24 hours, hence the placement of the house nearby. On the topic of the tree's origins, there are some possibilities. It could be a reference to the entrance of the first dungeon in Zelda NES, as it's a lone island with a big dead tree in the middle. It's surrounded by water, therefore the only way to access it is via a long bridge. But there are still a bunch of distinct differences between the two, and there's another area on this list that arguably matches this description more. The other possibility is that this could be an old Deku tree. Only 3 of them have been seen as of yet. One in Ocarina of Time, who dies shortly after the hero conquers his first dungeon, one in the Wind Waker, who's the adult form of the sapling found in Ocarina of Time, and the one within the Korok Forest in Breath of the Wild. If the tree was described as massive with resplendent branches, a great Deku tree matches this description. But there's also the withered forest trees from the Wind Waker. After the Korok ceremony, 8 trees are planted all across the sea. Once you water all the trees and complete the side quest, Link gets a piece of heart. The problem is, none of these trees are nearly big enough to match the size of the ancient tree stump, but it's possible when matured they would have grown to this size. So, long story short, this structure most likely served as a lookout post for the nearby village, which is now partially submerged underwater.
If there's one area I've been dying to talk about, it's the Breach of Demise. This landform cuts through the ridgeland, with multiple rocks protruding from the ground. The design of this terrain covers most of the surface in shadows, therefore only small bits of vegetation are seen growing. The dead trees imply that, at one time, the soil was suitable for plant growth. Or perhaps these are virtually leafless trees. There are 3 different entrances into this valley, through the Karok Bridge and both the North and West Hyrule Plains. But what are the origins of this landform? It's obviously a reference to the tale told in the opening of Skyward Sword. One dark, fateful day, the earth cracked wide and malevolent forces rushed forth from the fissure. What we see in Breath of the Wild closely resembles this description. It's as if the earth opened up to form a crack. The real question is, was this terrain named after this legend because it looked similar, or because this was where the Demon King first appeared? Is this where the Zelda series began thousands of years ago, with the humans of the surface? Possibly, but like other structures, it's most likely just a reference. Here's something that's interesting. There are 3 skulls that act as enemy bases. Nothing out of the ordinary here, you can find these structures all across Hyrule, but the file name for these is Skull Rock Bone, and the only ones that have this name are the 3 within this terrain. They're near identical to the appearance of the cliffs, so chances are that these camps were carved out of this bone rock. If you don't already know, these skulls aren't from skeletons. Aside from being carved to resemble skeletal remains, there are no other similarities. Plus, this bone rock is probably named off of its resemblance to the bone texture of the ancient Leviathans. Both the Millennia Spring and Skull Lake have the same rocky texture as the Breach of Demise, but neither have enemy camps within the terrain. If they did, then it's very likely we would have some Skull Rock Bone field object files within these locations. But the Breach of Demise stands as a very interesting landform in Breath of the Wild that, unfortunately, many don't talk about.
So, you've finally made it to the end of the Yiga clan's hideout. After giving a good old spanking to Master Koga, his own incompetence sends him falling to his doom. You take the Thunderhelm back to Riju and you proceed with your quest. But hold on, let's rewind a bit. What's with the giant bottomless pit in Koga's boss arena? We never get to see what's down there, if there even is anything down there. Thanks to the show Boundary Break, we can get a closer look at the pit. But as expected, there's nothing seen worth talking about. Nintendo isn't gonna bother with details if the player's never gonna see them. Well, aside from the random flowers growing in the Deku Tree's mouth. Let's start by pointing out the obvious. This bottomless pit isn't a bottomless pit. How do we know? Because of the Champion's Ballad DLC. One of Urbosa's shrines is activated by retrieving a Sheikah orb from the Yiga hideout and throwing it down the pit. We hear 2 sounds following this, the orb hitting the ground and a shrine pedestal activating. Therefore, somewhere at the bottom of this massive pit is an equally massive shrine pedestal. And also Koga's rotting corpse, but let's not stress on the details. But given all of this information, there's a believable explanation for the existence of this pit. It's to serve one purpose, the already mentioned Champion's Ballad quest. It was specifically built to be a puzzle for the hero. But if that's the case, why was it placed in the Yiga clan hideout of all places? Because the Yiga clan hideout isn't actually a Yiga clan hideout. Notice how the first room has smaller versions of the 7 heroine statues, ones connected to the Gerudo. The ones in the hideout's entrance are covered with the Yiga insignia. This is very normal. For example, certain statues built by the Sheikah are also covered with the Yiga's logo. Therefore, the statues in this circular room were built by the Gerudo, not them. And that's because this base used to belong to the Gerudo until it was taken over by the Yiga clan. And creating a champion proves this in the developer notes. It's actually an old Gerudo archaeological site that the Yiga snuck into and made their own. With this knowledge, it makes sense that the bottomless pit was placed here for the purpose of a shrine puzzle. In fact, there's no mention at all of the Yiga in Cass's song. The ancient riddle only states, "Throw the orb underground." The Yiga weren't planned to be a part of this puzzle. They just happened to steal the orb from the Gerudo and make it more difficult. But what about the bottomless pit at the Gerudo Tower? Less is known about it, but we can still talk about the landforms surrounding it. Some scaffolding has been left behind along the cliffside. It's possible that it was a part of Naboris' excavation 100 years ago, but whether anything was dug up from here or not is unknown.
If you're on a hunt for a 100% playthrough of Breath of the Wild, you're going to have to track down and beat all 120 shrines in the game. A lot of this time will be in Hebra, as it's the region with the most shrines. A whopping 13. There are a few interesting locations in this snowy mountain. It holds one of the 3 labyrinths, a mountain that creates a snowbird illusion when viewed from a certain angle, and collapsed caves like the Cold Snap Hollow and Paquita Stone Grove. But there's another secret that hides in plain sight, and it's in the highest mountain in Hebra. If you look closely, a giant hole can be seen going right through the Hebra peak. Once you notice, it can't really be unseen. But what were the events that led up to its creation? Or destruction, I guess? Step 1. Was it natural causes or man-made? It's hard to believe that nature could make such a perfectly shaped circle. The developer notes on page 312 of Creating a Champion tells us that the damaged portion of Hebra Peak is a scar from the battle against Calamity Ganon 10,000 years ago. The hole in this mountain has existed far before the events of the Great Calamity. But how was it damaged in the battle? We've never seen the abilities of the Calamity during this era, but his power must have been immense. So much where damaging the peak in this way would have been child's play. But the truth is, it wasn't Ganon who dealt this damage, but most likely the Sheikah. How? The lasers fired from the divine beasts. We get to see just how powerful they are in the final fight against Calamity Ganon, and their shape closely resembles the hole in the Hebra Peak. What's interesting is how this matches up with the tapestry in Impa's house. Mapping the Mapping the direction of this blast implies that Calamity Ganon was somewhere in Hyrule Field, which is where the final phase of the boss takes place. If we take the placement of him on the center of the tapestry as his literal location, then the fight 10,000 years ago may have been in the dead center of Hyrule. Meadow had fired its laser somewhere to the northwest of the Hebra Peak, and not in Rito Village. Either way, this additional detail just shows how much thought went into Breath of the Wild's world. I wonder what the sequel will have in store for us.
How can such a small area like Mecca Island be so bizarre? Because there's nothing there, and yet it feels like something should be. Directly west of the Great Hyrule Forest, this secluded island houses a few enemies. 6 choo-choos in the daytime and Stal enemies at night. 4 Stal Koblins, 3 Stal Lizalfos, and 2 Stal Moblins. And there's no Koroks for some reason. There's a dead tree in the center of the island with a rock nearby. It would be a perfect place to hide a Korok, and yet there's nothing. And the Stal enemies only spawn once you get to the middle of the island. It's very common in Zelda to trick the player into going for a specific item only for it to be some sort of trap, as if it's bait for the player. But nothing of the sort exists, except for the small rock which has ore underneath. Maybe this was done with the intention of being a troll. You go to a small island and see a rock by a dead tree, assume that it must be a Korok puzzle, but it's really just a common item. And the icing on the cake, monsters are waiting to ambush and kill you. Surprise! But aside from the dead tree, there are some bushes surrounding it that have certainly seen better days. Is this a reference to the level 1 entrance of Zelda NES? It could be, the numbers do add up. Though if we take into consideration the fireplace and piles of bones around the island, there's another in-universe possibility. Was this once an enemy camp that lived in isolation? Bokoblins may not be that smart, but they do have some intelligence. They're smart enough to create fires and grill their meat for food. Piles of bones are very common in these camps, alongside campfires. Perhaps they ran out of food on the island and died sometime after. While this is a believable story, there are 2 problems with it. The Lizalfos could have just swam off the island since they're aquatic creatures. Either the animals to which they belonged were brought over, or had always lived on this small landform. Either way, Mecca Island is, without a doubt, one of Breath of the Wild's strangest and most bizarre locations.
And now it's time for the honorable mentions. Ones that, while interesting, didn't make the list. There's a small mountain which separates the Gerudo Desert and Osira Plains, referred to as Mount Grenache. There's a shrine quest here where the player must cast the shadow of a snowball onto the pedestal. The mystery lies in this small shack. There's a written log recounting the findings of a brave soul who sought out the answer of the shrine's riddle. Unfortunately, the answer is never found and the entries just stop. This traveler mentions how they ran out of food, so the darker implementations are that they died on this mountain, never solving the puzzle. At least they didn't die in vain, as these entries were critical in assisting the hero with his own mission. Skull Lake is another area that was briefly mentioned in this video. It has the same rock as the Breach of Demise, along with one shrine at the top of a towering structure. The name comes from its top-down view on the map, as it resembles a skull. This is also where you first meet Kilton, a Hylian that is obsessed with monsters. The last one, admittedly, could have been added to the list. The Lanayru Promenade is a path connecting Kakariko Village to Mount Lanayru, but its design hints at being much more than a simple path. With exquisite stonework all across the trail, does it have any secrets? We do know from creating a champion that it used to be called Spider's Nest Mountain. But why? Well, the reason it was excluded from this list is because I have a whole video that delves into this mystery, so the link for that will be in the description below. Aside from that, thank you for watching this video, and special thanks to Zeltik for joining me once again.
Reminder that we go over some more strange locations on my channel, and a link to that episode will be in the description and end card of this video.
As always, I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I hope you all have a great Christmas. Or holidays, I guess, in case you don't celebrate Christmas. See you all next time.